The transport truck lurched to a stop, and through the canvas flap she could see nothing but white glare and dust. 22 years old, trained as a medical auxiliary, captured 3 weeks earlier when her field hospital was overrun. She sat wedged between other women, all of them silent, all of them bracing for what came next. They had been warned about this moment in training, told stories that made their blood run cold. American soldiers, they were taught, lacked the discipline of proper warriors. They would see captured women as prizes, as objects to be divided among the victors. The propaganda had been explicit and brutal in its descriptions. Now the moment had arrived, and her hands trembled as she gripped the small cloth bag containing her few possessions. The canvas flap was pulled back and fierce Texas sunlight flooded in, momentarily blinding them. Orders were shouted in English, a language she barely understood beyond a few medical terms. The women climbed down from the truck bed, stumbling on legs gone numb from the long ride. She expected rough hands, shoving, leering faces. Instead, there were simply soldiers standing at attention, their rifles held vertically against their shoulders, their faces blank and professional. They were remarkably tall, these Americans, well-nourished in a way that made her think of her own country's shortages. Their uniforms were clean and pressed despite the heat. They looked like men doing a job, not conquerors surveying spoils. An officer appeared, accompanied by a Japanese interpreter in civilian clothes. The interpreter was a woman, middle-aged, with tired eyes that suggested she had done this many times before. She called out instructions in clear Japanese, telling them to form 2 lines, to have their identification ready if they had any, to prepare for processing. The tone was businesslike, almost bored. There was no triumph in her voice, no contempt, nothing but procedure. The captured women exchanged confused glances as they shuffled into lines. Where was the violence they had been promised? Where were the hands grabbing at them, the shouted insults, the deliberate humiliation meant to break their spirits? The lines moved forward slowly toward a large tent. Guards flanked them on either side, maintaining careful distance. None of them spoke directly to the prisoners. When one woman stumbled, a guard stepped forward to steady her by the elbow, then immediately released his grip and stepped back to his position. The gesture was so swift and impersonal it seemed almost rehearsed. Inside the tent, the air was slightly cooler, though still oppressive. Tables were set up with American personnel seated behind them, clipboards and forms spread before them. Medical staff stood ready with equipment. Everything was organized with an efficiency that seemed almost mechanical. The young nurse found herself directed to a table where a sergeant sat with the female interpreter beside him. Name, the interpreter asked. Unit assignment, date of capture, location. The questions were factual, devoid of accusation or curiosity beyond what the forms required. She answered in a whisper, still waiting for the trap to spring. An identification tag was prepared, a metal disc with her name stamped in English letters she could barely read. She was given a number. She was told the rules of the camp, delivered in a flat monotone by the interpreter, who seemed to be reading from a script she had memorized long ago. Fraternization between American personnel and prisoners is strictly forbidden. Any violation will result in court-martial for the soldier involved. All communication must go through designated interpreters. Personal gifts or exchanges of any kind are prohibited. Medical care will be provided as needed. These are the terms of the Geneva Convention. The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of confusion through the waiting women. They had expected many things, but not this. Not rules that seemed designed to protect them from the very thing they feared most. Medical examinations followed, conducted with clinical detachment. A female medic checked her temperature, examined her for obvious injuries, noted a half-healed wound on her arm from shrapnel. The medic cleaned and rebandaged it without making eye contact, without asking unnecessary questions, without any gesture that might be construed as personal interest. An American doctor, older and grey-haired, listened to her lungs through a stethoscope, asked the interpreter to inquire about chronic conditions, then moved on to the next patient. He wore gloves throughout. He never touched her beyond what the examination required. His face remained professionally neutral, as if she were any patient in any hospital rather than an enemy captured in war. She sat on a wooden bench afterward, waiting for the next phase of processing, trying to make sense of what she was experiencing. Around her, other women whispered frantically to each other in Japanese, their voices high with disbelief. "This cannot be real," someone said. "They are playing a game with us. When we let our guard down, then they will show their true nature." But another voice, older and more thoughtful, disagreed. "I have seen Americans before," this woman said. "They live by their paperwork. Everything must follow their rules, or they become confused. Perhaps this is simply how they operate." A large sign dominated one wall of the tent, printed in both English and Japanese. The Japanese characters were carefully brushed, clearly done by someone who understood the language properly. No personal contact between United States personnel and prisoners of war. All requests, questions, or needs must be directed through the camp command structure via official interpreters. Violations of this policy are grounds for severe disciplinary action. She read it 3 times, each time finding it harder to reconcile with everything she had been taught about the enemy. This was not the behavior of undisciplined barbarians. This was something else entirely, something her training had not prepared her for. When processing was complete, they were led across an open yard toward rows of wooden barracks. The buildings were simple but solid, raised slightly off the ground, with screens on the windows to keep out insects. Barbed wire surrounded the entire compound. Guard towers stood at the corners. But within those boundaries, everything seemed organized with almost obsessive care. The paths between buildings were straight and regularly maintained. There was no trash, no disorder, no sense of the casual cruelty she had imagined. It looked more like a military base than a prison, though the barbed wire was a constant reminder of their status. Inside the barracks, the women found rows of metal-framed bunks, each with a thin mattress and folded blanket. Lockers stood at intervals, numbered in English. More signs on the walls outlined daily schedules, rules, and procedures. 2 female interpreters, American women in Women's Army Corps uniforms, stood ready to answer questions. They introduced themselves with names the Japanese women struggled to pronounce, then handed out bundles containing prison uniforms, towels, and personal items. Everything was grey or khaki, plain and utilitarian. Nothing was marked as specifically for prisoners. The items looked like standard military issue. The daily schedule was posted prominently. Wake up at 6 in the morning, breakfast at 6:30, roll call at 7, work details assigned according to ability, lunch at noon, free time in the afternoon for letter writing or rest, dinner at 5, lights out at 9 in the evening, every hour accounted for, every activity planned and structured. The rigidity of it was almost comforting in its predictability. There would be no surprises, no sudden inspections in the night, no random punishments. Everything would follow the schedule, and the schedule was posted for all to see. At first, the women moved through the barracks like ghosts, afraid to touch anything, afraid to speak too loudly. They had expected a cell, something dank and cramped and deliberately uncomfortable. Instead, they found accommodations that, while far from luxurious, were clean and organized. Some women broke down crying, overwhelmed by relief mixed with confusion. Others remained stoic, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. The young nurse chose a bunk near a window, storing her few possessions in the numbered locker, then sat stiffly on the edge of the mattress. She watched the other women settling in, watched the American interpreters moving among them, answering questions with patient efficiency, and felt a strange disconnection from reality. That first evening, dinner arrived on metal trays carried by civilian kitchen workers, supervised by a single guard who remained outside the barracks. The food was simple but adequate, more than many of them had eaten in recent months. Rice, vegetables, a portion of protein that might have been chicken or pork, bread, water. No one commented on the quality, They were too busy trying to understand why they were being fed at all with such regularity. In their training, they had been told prisoners were often starved as a matter of course. Yet here was food, delivered on schedule, in quantities designed to sustain rather than punish. After the meal, the women were left alone in their barracks. No guards entered. The doors were not locked from outside, though the compound itself was clearly secured. They could move within the barracks freely, use the shared bathroom facilities, talk among themselves without supervision. It was this freedom within captivity that proved most disorienting. They were not being watched every moment. They were being trusted to follow the rules without constant oversight. For women accustomed to strict hierarchies where superiors monitored every action, this relative autonomy felt wrong, as if they were being set up for some kind of test they did not understand. Night fell, and the compound lights came on, harsh and bright around the perimeter, but softer within the barracks. Through the screens, she could hear American voices, guards talking among themselves as they walked patrol routes. The conversations were casual, discussing sports or movies or plans for leave time. They sounded like ordinary men doing ordinary work, not soldiers guarding hated enemies. She lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, trying to process the day. Everything she had been told was wrong. Not just slightly inaccurate, but fundamentally, completely wrong. American soldiers were not savages. They were bureaucrats in uniform, following regulations with the same devotion Japanese soldiers followed orders from superiors. Sleep came fitfully that first night. Every sound made her tense, waiting for the inevitable moment when the facade would crack and the real treatment would begin. But the only sounds were routine ones, guards changing shifts, the distant hum of generators, crickets in the grass beyond the wire. When dawn came and nothing terrible had happened, she felt a cautious hope beginning to form, fragile as glass but real nonetheless. The morning routine established itself immediately. A bell rang at 6, loud and insistent. The women rose, some quickly and others groggily, making their bunks with the blankets folded in precise squares as instructed. They dressed in the provided uniforms, which fit reasonably well despite being clearly mass-produced. At 6:30, breakfast arrived on the same metal trays. At 7, they assembled outside for roll call. An American sergeant called out names from a list, the interpreter translating, and each woman answered when called. The process took perhaps 10 minutes, conducted without drama or unnecessary delay. Then they were dismissed back to the barracks to await work assignments. Work details, when they came, were mundane. Some women were assigned to the laundry facility, others to the kitchen gardens, still others to general maintenance and cleaning. The young nurse, because of her medical training, was assigned to assist at the camp infirmary under supervision. This meant spending her days with American medical personnel, watching how they treated the minor injuries and illnesses that arose among both guards and prisoners. It was here she saw the system at its most explicit. American soldiers who needed treatment sat in one area, prisoners in another. The same equipment was used for both, the same medications dispensed, the same professional care provided. But the two groups never mixed. Treatment times were staggered to avoid any interaction beyond the strictly necessary. The American medics spoke to her only through interpreters, giving instructions about supplies or procedures, but never engaging in personal conversation. They demonstrated techniques, showed her where things were stored, corrected her work when necessary, all with the same neutral professionalism they showed each other. There was no warmth, but there was also no hostility. She was simply another worker in the medical system, to be trained and utilized according to need. After several days, she realized this detachment extended to everything in the camp. The Americans had created a structure where emotions, whether positive or negative, had no place. Everything operated on policy and procedure. The other women reported similar experiences. Those working in the gardens were supervised from a distance, given tasks and left to complete them without micromanagement. Those in the laundry worked alongside civilian employees, following routines that had clearly been established long before their arrival, Everywhere the pattern was the same: clear instructions, minimal direct contact with male guards, and an almost obsessive adherence to written regulations. Some women began to relax, allowing themselves to believe the pattern would hold. Others remained suspicious, convinced the Americans were merely being patient, waiting for them to reveal something useful before showing their true intentions. The young nurse found herself in an odd position. Working in the infirmary meant she saw more Americans than most of the other prisoners. She observed them closely, trying to understand what motivated their restraint. Were they naturally cold people? Was this just how Americans behaved? Or was it, as she increasingly suspected, the result of intensive training and strict enforcement of military law? She noticed how the soldiers watched each other, how officers made regular inspections, how any interaction with prisoners was logged in writing. The system was designed not just to prevent abuse, but to make such abuse almost impossible without immediate detection. One afternoon, a guard delivered medical supplies to the infirmary. He was young, perhaps only a year or two older than her, with red hair and freckles that made him look almost boyish. He set the boxes down on the designated table, accepted the interpreter's confirmation of receipt, and turned to leave. On impulse, she said, "Thank you," in her limited English. He paused for just a moment, seemed about to respond, then simply nodded once and walked out. The interpreter gave her a sharp look. "Do not do that," the woman said quietly. "They are not allowed to respond, and you are not allowed to initiate contact. Follow the rules." The reprimand was gentle but firm. Even small gestures could not be tolerated within this system. Mail call came in the third week, announced with surprising ceremony. The women were assembled in the barracks and told they would be permitted to write letters home. The restrictions were explained in detail. No information about the camp's location or layout, no codes or hidden messages. Every letter would be read by censors before being sent, but within those constraints they could write freely to families. Paper and pencils were distributed, along with instruction sheets showing how to properly address envelopes. Many women stared at the blank paper for long minutes, unsure what to say. How could you explain this experience in a letter? How could you tell your family you were alive and well when the very concept seemed to contradict everything they believed about capture? The young nurse wrote carefully, choosing each word with deliberation. "I am alive and unharmed. The Americans follow strict rules about treatment of prisoners. We have food and shelter. I work in a medical facility. I think of you every day and hope this letter finds you well." She signed it simply with her name, folded it carefully, and placed it in the provided envelope. Around her, other women were writing similar messages, some crying silently as they worked. The emotional release of being able to communicate with the world beyond the wire was profound. It made them feel less like disappeared persons and more like humans temporarily separated from their lives. When the letters were collected, the interpreter assured them the mail would be sent as soon as censorship was complete. In about 4 to 6 weeks, they might expect replies, depending on the functioning of international mail systems during wartime. The wait would be long, but at least there was a connection now, a thread linking them to home. That night, conversation in the barracks was more animated than usual. Women speculated about what their families would think, whether the letters would actually arrive, what news might come back. For the first time since capture, they were speaking about the future with something other than dread. Days accumulated into weeks. The routines became so familiar they were performed almost unconsciously. Wake, dress, eat, work, rest, eat again, sleep. The mechanical nature of it was oddly soothing. There were no surprises, no sudden cruelties to endure, no tests of loyalty or endurance, just the steady progression of scheduled activities. The young nurse noticed changes in herself and the others. They moved more confidently through the camp. They spoke more freely among themselves, no longer whispering as if afraid of being overheard. Some women even began to laugh occasionally, sharing jokes or stories from before the war. The guards remained distant figures, present but uninvolved. They walked their patrol routes at exact intervals, changed shifts with military precision, responded to any breach of rules with immediate but measured enforcement. The young nurse watched one incident where a prisoner tried to approach the fence to retrieve a piece of paper blown by the wind. A guard intercepted her before she reached the wire, not roughly but firmly, directing her back toward the barracks. He did not shout or threaten. He simply prevented the action and logged it in his report. The woman was later called to speak with the camp administrator through an interpreter, reminded of the rules about perimeter boundaries, and dismissed with a warning notation in her file. The entire process was documented and procedural, lacking any personal animosity. This bureaucratic approach to discipline was perhaps the most foreign element of all. In the military she had known, punishment was often arbitrary and personal, delivered by superiors who might be angry or simply assertive of their authority. Here, every infraction triggered a process. Documentation, review, measured response. Even the guards seemed to be following a script, unable to deviate from established protocols. She realized this system protected the prisoners. Yes, but it also protected the guards from their own potential for cruelty. By making everything a matter of procedure rather than personal judgment, the Americans had removed the human element that might lead to abuse. Mail began arriving in return, thin envelopes with Japanese writing and stamps that had somehow made the journey across oceans and through war zones. The young nurse's letter from her mother was brief but precious. "We received your letter and wept with relief. Your brothers are serving in the South. Your father manages as best he can. We do not know what to think about your situation, but we are grateful you are alive. Come home to us when you can." She read it over and over, memorizing every character, every subtle indication of her mother's emotional state in the carefully chosen words. Other women received similar letters, and the barracks filled with a new kind of energy, bittersweet but fundamentally life-affirming. Some women received no letters at all, and their pain was evident in their silence. Families dead or missing, mail systems disrupted, addresses no longer valid. The interpreters handled these situations with practiced sensitivity, offering what comfort they could without overstepping the boundaries of their roles. The young nurse shared what portions of her letter she felt comfortable sharing, trying to give those without news some sense of connection to the world beyond. They were prisoners together, and that shared status created bonds that transcended the differences in their backgrounds and experiences. Summer deepened, and the heat became oppressive. Fans were installed in the barracks, a luxury that surprised everyone. The Americans seemed to have unlimited resources compared to what the women had known in their own military service. Regular supplies of clean water, adequate food, medical care, even small comforts like the fans. It reinforced a growing realization that America's strength lay not just in weapons, but in logistics, in the ability to supply and maintain forces across vast distances. This war was being won not by superior courage or fighting spirit, but by superior organization and industrial capacity. The nurse found herself thinking dangerous thoughts. What if everything she had been taught about her own country's inevitable victory was wrong? What if the propaganda had been lies designed to maintain morale in the face of inevitable defeat? The evidence was all around her. American soldiers who were well-fed and well-equipped, facilities that functioned efficiently, a system that could afford to treat prisoners according to written rules rather than expediency. She did not voice these thoughts, not even to her closest companions in the barracks, but they grew in her mind like seeds finding fertile ground. Work in the infirmary continued to be revealing. She watched American doctors treating their own wounded soldiers returned from combat, saw the care and attention given to even minor injuries, observed the genuine concern the medical staff showed for their patients. There was none of the harsh dismissal of weakness she had experienced in Japanese military medicine. Pain was acknowledged and treated. Psychological trauma was recognized as legitimate. Soldiers were not expected to simply endure and hide their suffering. The difference in approach was stark and troubling to everything she had been taught about proper military bearing. One day, an American soldier was brought in with a badly infected wound. He had apparently tried to ignore it, not wanting to report sick, and now it had become serious. The doctor was furious, not at the soldier, but at the culture that made men feel they had to hide injuries. "You could have lost this arm," the doctor said through the interpreter, though his anger was clearly directed at the system rather than the individual. "We are not savages. We treat our people. Report sick when you are sick." The soldier looked shamefaced but relieved. The interaction stayed with the nurse for days. This was not weakness, she slowly understood. This was a different philosophy of what made soldiers effective. As autumn approached, the camp settled into a different rhythm. The worst of the heat faded, making outdoor work less exhausting. The women had adapted to their circumstances, finding ways to maintain dignity and purpose even in captivity. They organized classes among themselves, teaching English to those interested, sharing skills in sewing or crafts, creating small social structures that gave their days meaning beyond mere survival. The Americans allowed this self-organization as long as it did not interfere with the camp's operations or violate any security rules. The young nurse began teaching basic medical knowledge to other prisoners, using her time to pass on what she knew. It gave her a sense of purpose and helped maintain the skills she had worked so hard to develop. The interpreters provided her with English medical terminology when asked, seeing no harm in education that might actually be useful. She found herself grateful for this permission, this small allowance of autonomy within the larger structure of control. It was more than she would have expected, more than the propaganda had suggested enemies would ever permit. She continued writing letters home every 2 weeks, each one a small act of connection across the vast distance. Her mother's replies came irregularly but steadily, each one a treasure to be read and reread. The news from home was often troubling, shortages worsening, casualties mounting, but underneath the careful phrasing she could sense her family's desperate hope that she would survive and return. It gave her something to hold on to, a reason to wake up each morning and move through the routines. The guards changed periodically, new faces replacing familiar ones as units rotated through the assignment. But the behaviour never changed. Each new guard maintained the same professional distance, followed the same regulations, showed the same careful avoidance of personal interaction. It was the system, not the individuals, that defined the treatment. This consistency was perhaps the most remarkable thing. In any organisation, there are those who bend or break rules, who let personal feelings override policy. Here, she saw no evidence of it. The military justice system that threatened court-martial for fraternization seemed to actually function as designed. Winter came, mild by her standards, but still requiring warmer clothing. Jackets and heavier blankets were distributed, again following documented procedures, everything logged and accounted for. The women no longer questioned these provisions. They had come to understand that the Americans would provide what was necessary according to their regulations, no more and no less. There would be no special favours, but also no deliberate deprivations. Everything was standardised, impersonal, rule-bound. The nurse thought often about what would happen when the war ended. Would she be returned to Japan? Would she be held indefinitely? Would there even be a Japan to return to, given the direction the war seemed to be taking? These questions haunted quiet moments, but could not be answered. She focused instead on the present, on the daily tasks that filled her hours, on the small satisfactions of maintaining her skills and helping others. It was all she could control. One cold evening, she stood near the barracks window watching guards walk their patrol routes, their breath visible in the chill air. They looked tired, bored even, going through motions that had long since become routine. She realized they were as trapped by the system as she was, constrained by rules that allowed no deviation, no authentic human connection across the divide of war. It was a prison for everyone, though the guards could at least leave at the end of their shifts. The recognition made her feel something unexpected, almost like sympathy. They were all caught in something larger than themselves. The months continued their steady progression. The mail kept arriving, letters from home that sustained hope even as the news grew increasingly bleak. Her brothers were still alive, her mother wrote, though one had been wounded and sent to recover in a hospital far from the fighting. Her father continued his work, trying to keep the family business operational despite shortages of materials and labour. They were surviving, as she was surviving, waiting for resolution of a conflict that seemed to have no clear end in sight. In the infirmary, she had become almost like regular staff, her competence recognised and utilised despite her status as a prisoner. The American medical personnel gave her more responsibility, allowing her to handle routine tasks with minimal supervision. It was a strange trust, built not on friendship but on professional recognition of ability. She took pride in this, in being seen as competent rather than simply as an enemy to be contained. It was a form of dignity she had not expected captivity to allow. The patterns held through winter and into spring. Wake, work, eat, rest, sleep. Mail every few weeks. Occasional changes to work assignments or daily schedules, but always announced in advance, always explained, always following documented procedures. The young nurse no longer woke in fear. She woke to routine, to predictability, to a life circumscribed but stable. It was not freedom, would never be freedom, but it was life continuing rather than merely being endured. She began to understand that survival came in many forms. There was the survival of the body, which the Americans ensured through adequate nutrition and medical care. There was the survival of the mind, which she maintained through work and study and connection with the other women. And there was the survival of something harder to name, some core sense of self that refused to be erased by circumstances. This was perhaps the most important survival, and the one she worked hardest to preserve. She was still herself, still the young woman who had chosen nursing, still someone with hopes and dreams beyond this barbed wire. The war continued somewhere beyond the compound walls, but inside the camp life had achieved a kind of stasis. The women knew they could not remain here forever. Eventually there would be resolution, victory or defeat, and their fates would be decided by forces far beyond their control. Until then, they existed in this strange limbo, neither free nor truly imprisoned, sustained by rules they had once feared but now almost welcomed. The young nurse had stopped trying to predict the future. She focused on each day as it came, finding small purposes and satisfactions where she could, writing her letters home, doing her work, existing within the confines allowed to her. It was not the life she had imagined, but it was life nonetheless. And in a world at war, perhaps that was enough.